It was the Monday after Thanksgiving when I first saw it, lying there on the welcome mat like some grotesque gift, a dead fish, gray scales dulled, glassy eyes staring up at me as if accusing me of something I had not done. My name is Daniel Carter. I am 38 years old. I live in a suburban neighborhood outside Dallas where lawns are cut in clean lines, flags flap on porches, and neighbors wave even if they hate you. We bought this house 3 years ago because it looked safe, middle America at its finest. Cul-de-sacs and little league signs. But what they never tell you in the brochures is that a neighborhood is only as good as its people. And when you get a bad neighbor, the kind of man who thinks torment is a hobby, you discover how fast the dream turns sour. I bent down to pick up the fish, still damp, and the smell hit me hard, a mixture of river mud and rot. And I looked up across the street, and there he was, standing in his yard with a rake, pretending to gather leaves that were not there, staring with that look I had come to know too well, a half smirk, half snarl. His name was Gary Henson, a man in his 50s with a belly like a keg and a beard stained yellow from cheap beer, the kind of neighbor you dread, the bad neighbor you read about in lawsuits and late-night Reddit stories, the archetype of suburban malice. He never waved, he complained about everything. He wrote notes to the HOA about my recycling bins being visible for 5 extra minutes, and now, I was sure, he was the one leaving fish on my porch. At first my wife, Laura, laughed, thought maybe a raccoon had dragged it there, or some prank kids from the high school football team had taken a detour. But then Tuesday came and there was another one, a smaller base, dropped right on the steps like an offering. By Friday I had collected 5 fish in a single week, each one fresher than the last, each one left neatly, as if someone cared about presentation. I bagged them, photographed them, even checked my Ring camera, but of course the angle missed the exact corner where the fish were placed. The police laughed when I called, told me it was not a crime, just a nuisance, and one officer actually said, "At least it is not a flaming bag of dog crap." I could feel the humiliation eating at me because it was not just about the fish, it was about the fact that someone had chosen me as their target, that I was the weak link, and every morning I opened my front door, I was reminded of it. The emotion started as confusion, then embarrassment, then anger. Laura rolled her eyes and told me to drop it, but my kids started telling their friends about Dad's fish porch, and soon enough the neighborhood kids were giggling when they rode their bikes by my driveway. I was the joke of the block, the man with the rotting fish collection, and I could feel Gary watching from across the street, enjoying every second of it. The thing about bad neighbors is that they know how to needle you without ever crossing the line where you can drag them into court. They exist in that gray space of harassment where police shrug, lawyers charge too much, and the HOA says file a complaint while sipping margaritas at their pool. By the second week, I started to feel like I was in some kind of conspiracy, like this was bigger than just Gary. What if this was some secret code? What if there was an underground network of bad neighbors across America who sent each other fish as signals? A suburban mafia with salmon instead of bullets? I stayed up late Googling fish left on porch meaning, and I found everything from Native American omens to Sicilian warnings to bizarre Reddit theories about witchcraft. I convinced myself maybe Gary was not just a cranky drunk, but some kind of suburban sorcerer, casting spells with trout and catfish, trying to hex me into moving out. At work, I would catch myself staring at blueprints with the image of that glassy fisheye burned into my brain, and my coworkers started asking if I was sick. No, I was not sick. I was under siege. The third week was the tipping point. That Monday morning I opened the door and found a carp nailed to the doorframe, nailed with a thick roofing nail, blood dripping onto the wood like some biblical plague. That was when I knew this was not random, this was personal. My porch smelled like a dockyard, my kids refused to go out at the front door, and Laura started pressing me to either call a lawyer or sell the house. But I am not the type to run. You grow up in Texas, and you learn that running from a fight just makes the other guy hungrier. I started thinking about how Americans get even. Not with fists, not with midnight shouting, but with paper, with documents, with signatures and fines and insurance claims and federal codes that grind a man down until he begs for mercy. But before I got there, I had to feel the weight of helplessness. I scrubbed my porch with bleach until my hands cracked. I ordered cameras from Amazon. I even thought about hiring a private investigator. At night, I would sit in my truck with the engine off, waiting to catch him in the act, but somehow he always slipped to me. The fish kept coming, and I started to feel like maybe he had accomplices. Maybe the mailman was in on it. Maybe even the HOA president. The paranoia grew because once you have a bad neighbor, you stop trusting the whole neighborhood. Every glance feels like a smirk. Every laugh across the fence feels like it is at your expense. And soon enough, you are living in a prison of suspicion. The first time I fantasized about revenge was when I looked at my mortgage bill. I thought about how banks foreclose on people over the smallest mistakes, how insurance companies deny claims with a smile, how the IRS never forgets a penny. I realized that if Gary thought fish were a weapon, I had a whole arsenal of American systems to turn against him. Legal, financial, bureaucratic. I could become the ghost in his mailbox, the signature on a certified letter that made his stomach drop. Revenge, in America, does not need fists. It needs paperwork. That night, sitting on my porch with the faint smell of bleach still clinging to the air, I decided I would not just endure this. I would study him, learn his weaknesses, and I would use every tool available, not as some hot-headed neighbor, but as a citizen who understood the power of codes, clauses, and claims. Gary thought he was playing a game with fish, but I would answer with an ocean of red tape that would drown him slowly. He was a bad neighbor, but I could become his bad dream. By the time December rolled in, the smell of fish had become part of my mornings the way coffee and news used to be. It was there even when no fish lay on the porch, a ghost odor clinging to the wood. A reminder that Gary, the bad neighbor across the street, had me pinned in his little psychological war. One Monday, I opened the door to find not a fish, but a styrofoam cooler with a bow on top. Inside, a pile of crushed ice and 3 freshly dead trout staring at me as if I had just walked into a crime scene. I stood there in my robe, numb, hearing the distant hum of lawnmowers and car engines. The soundtrack of suburbia continuing as if nothing was wrong, while I held a cooler full of evidence that my life had become some grotesque parody of an American dream. My wife Laura had stopped laughing weeks ago. She looked at me differently now, like I was the problem for letting it continue. She said things like, maybe you should just apologize to him, as if I had started this, as if somehow my recycling bin or my leaf blower had provoked a man into making a ritual of dead fish deliveries. My kids no longer invited friends over because, as my son put it, nobody wants to hang out at the fish house. I wanted to scream at them all that they did not understand what it was like to live across from Gary, to have a bad neighbor with no conscience. A man who lived for the quiet sabotage of others. A man who thought harassment was as natural as mowing his patchy lawn. The worst part was the humiliation. I would haul the fish to the garbage can, wrapping them in double plastic bags, while joggers ran by and slowed their pace, glancing at me like I was some backwoods poacher dumping contraband. Even the mailman raised his eyebrows one morning when he handed me a package and looked down at the porch where fish blood had left a faint stain. I felt reduced, emasculated, the guy who could not even control his own front door. When you live in America, where pride and property intertwine like DNA, being the guy who cannot protect his porch from a neighbor is a deep gnawing shame. I began documenting everything. Every fish went into a Ziploc, every photo was time-stamped. I filed 3 separate reports with the police, and each time the officer barely contained a smirk. "It's a nuisance, not a crime," they repeated, like a chorus line. I contacted the HOA, who told me to fill out a complaint form and submit it with my quarterly dues. The form was 5 pages long and asked me to attach photographs, which I did, but weeks passed, and all I received back was a form letter reminding me to keep my grass under 6 inches. The systems that were supposed to help me had turned into a joke, and Gary knew it. I could see it in his swagger, the way he dragged his trash bins to the curb while whistling off-key, the way he waved at other neighbors, but never at me. He was winning because humiliation was his true weapon. The breaking point came when I found a fish nailed directly to the wooden railing of my porch. It was not just left there like the others. This one was a declaration. A fat carp, nailed clean through the body, its mouth gaping wide, its scales glittering under the porch light, as if mocking me. I stood there at dawn, hammer in hand, prying the nail out while my daughter watched from inside the glass door, her face pale. That image seared into me. My little girl seeing me as powerless, as a man on his knees before a fish. That was when anger overtook humiliation, when I stopped thinking of this as a neighborly feud and started seeing it as a war, one that had to be fought, the American way, not with fists, but with consequences. I began studying Gary the way a prosecutor studies a defendant. I knew his routine. He drove a rusting Dodge Ram with expired tags. He parked half on the curb. He left his trash cans out for days. He smoked on his porch even though HOA guidelines forbade it. He was sloppy, and sloppy men in America leave trails. I started a notebook, writing down dates, times, everything. I went online and pulled his property records from the county assessor's website, finding out he was 3 months behind on taxes. I checked the state database and saw he still had an old business license for a roofing company that had been dissolved years ago, which meant he was probably skating by without proper insurance. I realized then that the fish were just the surface. Beneath them lay a mountain of leverage waiting to be used. Meanwhile, the fish escalated. One morning it was not just a fish, but a bag of fish guts, leaking red across my welcome mat. Another morning, it was a frozen tilapia, thawing slowly under the Texas sun, its flesh turning mushy as flies swarmed. I began to imagine Gary laughing in his kitchen, drinking his cheap beer, watching from his window as I discovered each new insult. That laughter became a soundtrack in my head, driving me deeper into obsession. My coworkers noticed I was distracted, zoning out during meetings, doodling fish shapes on blueprints. My wife threatened to take the kids to her mother's if I did not end this madness. I wanted to tell her that this was not madness, this was war, and wars are not ended by ignoring the enemy. What gnawed at me most was the feeling that Gary understood something about America that I had forgotten. Power does not always come from strength, it comes from persistence, from knowing how far you can push someone before they break. He had turned me into a case study in bad neighbors, and I knew that if I did nothing, this would define me forever. I could either live as the man who accepted humiliation, or I could strike back with the tools this country provides: law, finance, bureaucracy, and the endless patience to let paperwork grind him down. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the fish notebook open, my laptop glowing, and I began outlining strategies like a general. Code violations, tax liens, anonymous tips to insurance regulators, letters to the IRS. Gary thought he was clever, but America is a land where the smallest oversight can cost you everything, where a missed form or an unpaid fine can snowball into ruin. I began to see him not as my tormentor, but as a file to be built, a target to be processed through the great machinery of law and order. I would stop reacting to the fish. Instead, I would start building a case, one so airtight that even Gary's smirk could not survive it. By the end of December, I no longer felt humiliated. I felt resolved. The fish were still coming, but now they were just evidence, proof of a bad neighbor's malice, each one a nail in his own coffin. I had stopped being the victim. I was becoming the plaintiff, the complainant, the citizen armed with statutes and codes. And though Gary did not know it yet, he had already lost. By January, my notebook was thick with notes, property records, photographs, and the kind of obsessive scribbles that would make a detective proud and a therapist concerned. I had stopped caring about the smell on my porch, stopped caring about Laura's sighs when she walked past the garbage bin filled with fish corpses. What mattered now was the bigger picture. Gary thought he was clever, thought he could play this game forever, but I had discovered the only truth that matters when you live in America. No man can survive forever against bureaucracy. You can fight a neighbor across the street, you can fight a man with fists, but you cannot fight paperwork. Paperwork is immortal. The first step was insurance. I knew from my online digging that Gary's old roofing company had left him exposed. He bragged once, drunk on his porch, that he still did a few jobs under the table. Well, under the table is fine until someone reports you for working without liability coverage. I made a few anonymous calls to the state insurance commissioner, spoke in my most professional voice, and within 2 weeks, Gary had a letter taped to his door. I watched from my window as he yanked it off and crumpled it in his fist. The sight gave me a rush that no whiskey or Victory cigar could match. Next came taxes. This country runs on money, and when you do not pay Uncle Sam, he notices. Gary was already 3 months behind on property taxes. I sent in a tip through the IRS whistleblower program, attaching suspicions of unreported roofing income. Whether they acted on it or not, I did not care. What mattered was that Gary's name was now in the system, flagged, waiting like a ticking bomb. Every time he opened his mailbox, he would wonder if today was the day the hammer dropped. That was my gift to him, paranoia wrapped in an official envelope. Meanwhile, I started noticing the cracks in his life. His Dodge Ram had expired tags. Easy enough. I called the non-emergency police line and reported an abandoned vehicle. Within days, a bright orange sticker appeared on his windshield. He had 48 hours to move it or risk towing. He stormed around his yard, shouting into his phone, cursing whoever had done it. I sat on my porch sipping coffee, my face blank. While inside I was laughing so hard my ribs hurt. But I did not stop there. I went full American. I combed through the HOA guidelines like they were the Constitution, highlighting every violation Gary had ever committed. Cigarette butts on the porch, trash bins visible from the street, a satellite dish mounted improperly. I submitted a 30-page complaint dossier with photos, dates, and citations, bound in a folder like a lawyer's exhibit. The HOA could not ignore it. They sent him fine after fine, each one small but cumulative. And I knew that a man like Gary, who hated authority, would rather choke on a fishbone than write a check to the HOA. I pictured him fuming at his kitchen table, the same way I had fumed at mine, and I realized I had turned the tables completely. The fish still came, of course. He was not going to stop, not yet. But now, each fish felt like desperation, like a tantrum from a man who was losing ground. One morning I found a frozen salmon propped against the door, and instead of rage I felt amusement. I bagged it, logged it, added it to the evidence pile. It was not harassment anymore. It was material. I joked to myself that one day I would publish a book called 101 Fish and dedicate it to him. And yet, the deeper I went, the more absurd it became. I started imagining Gary as part of a larger conspiracy of bad neighbors, a secret fraternity that stretched across America, each member tormenting the family next door in their own creative way. Maybe in Ohio, someone left raccoon carcasses. Maybe in Florida, someone poured sugar in gas tanks. The fish were just Gary's signature, his initiation rite. I half convinced myself there was a bad neighbors lodge somewhere, complete with secret handshakes and bumper stickers, where they bragged about their exploits while drinking Budweiser under flickering fluorescent lights. The more I thought about it, the more I laughed, and the laughter made me feel powerful, like I had cracked their code. But here is the thing about fighting fire with fire. Eventually, the blaze takes on a life of its own. I found myself filing complaints against Gary for things that had nothing to do with fish. His Christmas lights were still up in February. Fine. His grass had a brown patch. Fine. His dog barked past 10 p.m. Fine. I was no longer just a victim defending myself. I had become his personal auditor, his bureaucratic shadow, the man who weaponized the very systems that had ignored me. Every time I dropped another envelope into the HOA's box or clicked submit on a city complaint form, I felt a jolt of satisfaction. Gary wanted a war, and I had given him one he could never win. Laura started noticing the change. She said my eyes looked brighter, like I had a secret. She did not ask, and I did not tell her. The kids went back to bringing friends over, because the fish had become less frequent, and when they did appear, I treated them with clinical detachment, as if they were nothing more than paperwork in my growing case file. Gary must have sensed it, because one night, while I was taking the trash out, he shouted across the street, "You think you're funny, huh?" His voice cracked, not with confidence but with strain. That was when I knew I had broken him. The next week, something miraculous happened. For the first time in months, Monday morning came, and there was no fish. Tuesday, no fish. Wednesday, no fish. The porch was clean, almost too clean, and the silence felt heavy, like the pause before a storm. I wanted to believe it was over, that he had given up. But I knew better. Bad neighbors do not stop. They regroup. And I was ready, my arsenal of paperwork stacked higher than his pile of fish. In America, wars do not end with treaties. They end with bankruptcies, liens, foreclosures, and moving trucks. Gary had drawn first blood with his fish, but I had drawn last blood with my forms, my complaints, my anonymous tips. This was not just a battle of porches anymore. This was the slow grind of systems, the American way of war, and I was finally on the winning side. By March, the neighborhood had shifted. The quiet cul-de-sac outside Dallas, once my daily stage for humiliation, had turned into a courtroom without walls, and Gary was on trial whether he realized it or not. The fish campaign slowed, sputtered, and finally stalled, but the real damage had already begun. Every week I saw new envelopes in his mailbox, the kind that carried weight, return addresses from the county, the state, the insurance commission. One morning I saw him tearing one open right at the curb, his face turning red as he read, crumpling the paper and kicking at the ground like a child. It was the look of a man discovering that bureaucracy is not a punchline, it is a death sentence written in fine print. The first tangible blow came when the city cited him for multiple vehicle violations. That rusted Dodge Ram of his, the one he liked to rev at midnight, was slapped with a citation for expired tags and improper curb parking. And he moved it 2 streets over to avoid towing, but then neighbors complained about suspicious activity. And within a week, the Ram disappeared entirely. Whether it was towed or repossessed, I never knew. What I did know was that Gary now walked to the gas station for his beer, a man reduced from horsepower to foot traffic. I watched him from my porch, sipping coffee, feeling the smug satisfaction that only comes when the law itself seems to be playing on your team. But the bigger blow came from money. The HOA had taken my dossier seriously, too seriously in fact. They hit him with a cascade of fines: improper trash storage, unsanctioned satellite dish, unkempt lawn, porch smoking. He tried to fight back, storming into the HOA office during a meeting, shouting about witch hunts and conspiracies. But the board members stared at him with the dead eyes of bureaucrats who had heard it all before. They smiled politely, wrote notes, and sent him home with even more fines. That is the American way. You cannot scream your way out of a late fee. You pay, or the fee multiplies. Soon enough, liens appeared on his property. I knew because I checked. His castle, his fortress of petty torment, was turning into quicksand beneath his feet. Insurance was the slow burn. The anonymous tips I sent about his under-the-table roofing work triggered an investigation. I do not know the details, but one day, a white sedan with state plates parked in front of his house for 3 hours. 2 men in suits knocked on his door. Gary argued on the porch, waving his arms, veins popping in his neck. The men did not flinch. They left him with a stack of papers, and I swear he looked smaller after they drove off, like a balloon losing air. A week later, I overheard him on the phone shouting, "I don't have that kind of money." That was when I knew the fish war had escalated into something larger, a financial siege. By April, Gary was unraveling. His lawn grew wild because the fines had broken his will to mow. He stopped talking to the few neighbors who still tolerated him. His beer cans piled higher, his porch light burned out and stayed out. One night, I caught him pacing in the yard, muttering to himself, looking across the street at my house, like I was a shadow only he could see. In a way, I had become that, not just Daniel Carter the neighbor, but a force, the embodiment of every form, every fine, every code he had ignored for years. The fish had been his language of malice. Paperwork was mine, and paperwork, in America, always outlives the man who resents it. It would have been enough, perhaps, to let him stew in his misery, but fate had more to add. His mortgage company filed a notice of default. I discovered it through public records, sitting in my truck at lunch break with a sandwich in one hand and my phone in the other. There it was, in black and white. Gary Henson, behind on payments, foreclosure proceedings initiated. My heart raced, not with joy exactly, but with a strange sense of cosmic balance. The man who had nailed fish to my door was now drowning under debts and liens and letters stamped final notice. The neighborhood began whispering. Suburban America thrives on gossip, and Gary had become the villain of every driveway conversation. Mrs. Turner down the block told Laura she had heard Gary was being investigated for tax fraud. Mr. Jenkins claimed he saw a sheriff's deputy deliver papers. Whether any of it was true no longer mattered. Reputation in a neighborhood is currency, and Gary's had been bankrupt for months. He was no longer just a bad neighbor. He was the bad neighbor, the cautionary tale parents told their kids when they asked why Dad looked stressed reading the mail. By May, moving trucks appeared. Not the cheerful kind, not the kind where families pose for photos in front of their new home. These were grim, silent, rented trucks. Men carried out furniture while Gary sat on his porch, slouched, a cigarette dangling from his lips, watching as his life was boxed up. He did not look at me, not once, though I sat outside deliberately, sipping a Bud Light, pretending to read the paper. It was the quietest victory I had ever tasted. No shouting, no confrontation, no fish nailed to doors. Just the slow, grinding sound of cardboard boxes and furniture being hauled away, the American process machine having chewed him up and spit him out. And yet, as I watched him go, I did not feel pure triumph. What I felt was something heavier, stranger. Because in the end, Gary was not just a bad neighbor. He was a man who underestimated the system, who thought personal spite could survive in a country built on codes and clauses. He fought with fish. I fought with forms. And in America, the forms always win. Still, watching him climb into the cab of that truck, his beard unkempt, his eyes hollow, I felt a flicker of pity. He had wanted to make me small, to humiliate me, but instead he had shrunk into nothing. The house sat empty for months, a foreclosure sign staked in the yard like a warning. Grass grew waist-high, weeds curled along the driveway, and for the first time in years, I breathed easy stepping out onto my porch. No fish, no smirks, no bad neighbor across the street. And yet, sometimes at night, when the wind carried the faint smell of the nearby creek, I thought I smelled fish again, just for a second, as if the war had left a permanent stain on the air. But if I learned anything, it was this. America does not forgive bad neighbors. It catalogs them, fines them, bankrupts them, and drives them out. Gary had taught me that a porch is sacred ground, and the way you defend it defines who you are. My defense had not been loud or violent. It had been legal, financial, bureaucratic. And in this country, that is the sharpest revenge of all. The first summer without Gary across the street felt like waking up from a fever dream. The foreclosure sign came down, the lawn service finally hacked the jungle back into something resembling grass, and a fresh coat of beige paint erased the cigarette stains that had clung to his porch like scars. A young couple moved in with a golden retriever, the kind of neighbors who wave with both hands and bake cookies for Christmas, and suddenly our cul-de-sac looked like a Norman Rockwell painting again. Kids played basketball in the driveways, flags fluttered, sprinklers ticked rhythmically at dawn, and the porch, my porch, was finally clean. No more fish, no more rotting stench seeping into my mornings. And yet, something inside me had shifted. When I opened the door each Monday morning, even months later, a part of me still expected to see a fish laid out like a calling card. I had won, yes, but the war had etched itself into me. I had learned to see the world not as neighbors and friends, but as files and violations, as mortgages and liens and tax codes. It was not just Gary who had been transformed by this battle. I had too. America teaches you that revenge can be righteous if it comes with a seal, a letterhead, or a case number, and I had embraced it completely. Sometimes, in the quiet of night, I thought about the absurdity of it all. Dead fish, for God's sake. Who does that? And then I remembered the look on Gary's face the day he left, hollowed out, stripped bare not by fists or shouts, but by 1,000 paper cuts delivered by the very systems he had thought he could ignore. That was the lesson. Bad neighbors rot not just the street, but themselves. They invite the machinery of America into their lives without realizing how merciless that machinery can be. Gary was gone, but in a way, he had become a symbol, a reminder that even the pettiest wars can end with ruin if you underestimate the power of persistence. The conspiracy theories I once half-joked about, secret lodges of bad neighbors, suburban mafias of harassment, never really left my head. Maybe Gary had been part of something larger. Maybe across the country, in cul-de-sacs from Ohio to Florida, other men were leaving carcasses on porches, sugar in gas tanks, weeds planted deliberately in rival lawns. Maybe what I experienced was not just personal, but systemic, a hidden current of malice running under the surface of suburban life. Some nights I would sip bourbon on my porch and imagine congressional hearings titled "The Bad Neighbors Problem: An American Crisis." Senators holding up photographs of fish nailed to doors, insurance executives testifying about spikes and bizarre claims, homeowners crying on camera about ruined lawns and poisoned pets. It was ludicrous, yes, but was it really that far-fetched? After all, my story had happened. And if it could happen here, why not everywhere? The longer I lived without Gary across the street, the more I realized how much energy I had invested in fighting him. It had consumed me, reshaped my marriage, forced me into a version of myself I had never expected to become. Laura eventually admitted she was glad I had handled it, though she never asked exactly how. She thought the fish stopped because Gary got bored. I let her think that. The kids eventually stopped joking about the fish porch, though my son once asked if I had made Gary move. I told him people make themselves move when they stop following the rules. That was the truth in its own way. If there was a lesson in all this, it was that bad neighbors test not just your patience, but your identity. They force you to choose. Do you bend? Do you break? Or do you fight back? And if you fight back, what weapons do you use? I chose paperwork, the American arsenal. Some men use fists, some use fire, but the truly devastating battles are fought with signatures, deadlines, and fines. Gary had tried to humiliate me with fish, but I had buried him with bureaucracy. And yet, even as I stood victorious, sipping coffee on my porch, I felt the faint unease of knowing how thin the line is between order and chaos. One bad neighbor had nearly undone me. What if the next one was smarter? The house across the street was bright now, with flower beds and fairy lights, but sometimes when the wind shifted, I still thought I saw a glint on the porch, a flash of silver like scales. Once in late August, I found a single fish scale wedged in the crack of my wooden step, gleaming under the Texas sun. I picked it up, turned it over in my hand, and felt a chill. Was it left over from the war, lodged there months ago, or was it a sign that the curse of the bad neighbor never truly ends? I dropped it into the trash, washed my hands twice, and told myself it was nothing. But that night, I dreamed of fish again, dozens of them, piled high, staring at me with their blank eyes, and Gary's voice whispering, "You think you've won, but bad neighbors never die." I woke up sweating, staring out the window at the empty driveway across the street, and I realized something important. Victory is not permanent. Peace is not guaranteed. The systems that had worked for me could work against me if I ever slipped. In America, you are always one missed payment, one forgotten form, one careless mistake away from being the man with envelopes piling in his mailbox, the man everyone whispers about. Gary had shown me that the line between citizen and cautionary tale is paper thin. So, I live carefully now. I pay every bill on time. I triple-check my property lines. I keep my trash bins pulled in before sunset. I wave at every neighbor, even the ones who scowl back. I am polite at HOA meetings. I donate to the local fire department. I even mow an extra strip of grass if it borders someone else's yard. Because the war taught me this. Every neighborhood has the potential for bad neighbors. And once the war starts, nobody really wins. You just hope you come out cleaner than the other guy. Still, when I sit on my porch with a cup of coffee and the golden retriever barks happily across the street, I allow myself a smile. Gary is gone. The fish are gone. My porch is mine again. That, in the end, is enough.